Welcome and thank you for joining us for the Grantmakers in the Arts 2019 webinar, I Already Fund ALAANA Organizations, Now What? I'm Sherilyn Seeley, Program Manager for Grantmakers in the Arts. Grantmakers in the Arts is committed to addressing structural inequities and increasing philanthropic and government support for African, Latinx, Asian, Arab, and Native American artists and arts organizations. Creating racial equity statements and threading racial equity practices and policies into our work are concrete and important actions to take in order to achieve racial justice. In July, we began this conversation via a podcast on the Mosaics Network and Fund. And now we are glad to have Lori Villarosa, founder and executive director of Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, and Maurine Knighton, program director for the arts at Doris Charitable Foundation. They will provide us with statistics, tools, and strategies for taking your funding to the next level while keeping racial equity at the forefront. Maurine Knighton is the program director for the arts at the Doris Charitable Foundation. She's responsible for developing and overseeing grant-making programs that support contemporary dance, theater, and jazz. Prior to Doris Charitable Foundation, Knighton was the Senior Vice President for grant-making at the Nathan Cummings Foundation. She has also served as Senior Vice President for Program and Nonprofit Investment at the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. She is a former board member of Grantmakers in the Arts, where she chaired its Racial Equity Committee. Lori Villarosa is the founder and executive director of the Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, which has had the mission of increasing the amount and effectiveness of resources aimed at combating institutional and structural racism since 2003. Villarosa has been a pioneer working at the intersection of racial justice and philanthropy for more than 28 years, deeply engaging with hundreds of funders at the community level, regionally, nationally, and internationally, to advance the use of a structural racism lens in their grant-making and effectively align their internal practices to sustain such a lens. We're glad to have them joining us. At the very end of the presentation, I will be joining to facilitate a Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to our presenters. Welcome, Maurine and Lori. Lori, why don't you get us started?
Great. Thank you so much, Sherilyn. I really appreciate the warm introduction, and it's great to see everybody joining. I'm hoping that you can all hear me fine. So I am Lori Villarosa, as Sherilyn said, and just a little bit about Pri in addition to what she shared. We were started with a board of racial justice practitioners, and I like to lift that up because it really was in starting from a space of thinking about who should be driving strategy for philanthropy that we launched Pri back in the beginning of 2003. And a lot of the folks who are our original board were actually my grantees when I was at the Mott Foundation, and moving and advancing a portfolio that was focused on institutional and societal racism, who were a lot of the undoing racism, anti-racist, and structural racism leaders of the time through the 90s. And we are really focused on continuing to center that voice and in the way that we do all of our work. And today we're still a small team with my colleague Paris Grigsby, as operations manager. The lessons I'll be sharing are based on work, though, that we've learned from a broad number of activists, racial justice activists, and funders. So one of the things that we'll be talking about today is really lifting up some key lessons that some of you may be familiar with, a guide that we produced in partnership with GrantCraft back in 2006. It was called the Grant Making with a Racial Equity Lens Guide, and I like to lift up that it came out before the iPhone. It actually was published 6 months before the iPhone, and when I think about that moment and think about where the field was, and the field of philanthropy was still very centered on more universal approaches and really a bit of the colorblind approach, and so we tried to focus on why it was important to lift up a racial equity lens. Obviously, the field has evolved greatly since then, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the distinctions as we have been looking to update that work, and we'll be putting out in the next 2 weeks, actually, a guide to grant making with a racial justice lens. Some of you all may have seen on our website a preview of that piece that we shared that shares a number of changes in the landscape, and so I just want to hit on a few of those today. I'm going to populate those all. So some of the key racial equity and racial justice landscapes for the NGOs across this past decade, and I'm sorry, I should back up to say this work was done centering first the voices of practitioners, and so we interviewed and did focus groups with more than 50, well, probably with the focus groups it gets to be even higher numbers of racial justice activists and practitioners, and then we turned to the funders. We started with the practitioners about what they wanted to see philanthropy doing, and then combined with those two pieces, here are some of the recaps. And it's important to think about the context of this last decade, and that we've seen a clear growth and increased capacity and leadership of racial justice organizations. And while that might seem obvious, we still have a lot of the languages and the way that philanthropy tries to think about what they should be doing around racial equity and racial justice overly built in a deficit model. And this goes beyond shifting from a deficit model to an assets model. It's really recognizing that there is significant leadership happening that is moving all of our areas of democracy, and that level of impact is what we would lift up as what you should all have undergirding your rationale for deepening your racial justice work. Also, what has been happening is a considerable number of white-led organizations further embracing equity, and we're going to talk a little bit more about some of what has been positive about that and some of what's been challenging about that, in particular in the relationship to the funding world. There's been much more intersectional work and much deeper awareness and understanding of that, both intersectionality in terms of different identities and understanding that we don't live single-issued lives, we aren't single-issued people, and also in cutting across different sectors. And then there's greater work that's going to scale, but also the challenges of scale. So there is also this question of the field tends to have an ability to fund more like rapid response, or has moved in this way of thinking about how to support emerging work, and hasn't necessarily kept up and grown at the same level as the field itself has grown. And then lastly, from an ecosystem standpoint, there's much greater awareness that no one approach can work alone. And for those of you who are coming into the work just in more recent years, this might not seem like a big aha, but really in the 90s, and I would say even through the early part of the 2000s, there was much more tension in the field of this sort of either or in approaches that we've moved past in a lot of spaces, and much more holistic approaches. On the funder side, a few of the key points that we would lift up is that I'm going to talk a little bit more about statistics in a few minutes, and the numbers are pretty abysmal on some of our giving, but in terms of actual funder understanding, it's important to recognize that there are more funders of all types in each region of the country that have some awareness of structural racism, implicit bias, and the ubiquitous, equality does not equal equity standpoint. And we're not going to go through those basics. I know that you had an earlier training through Grantmakers in Arts. Some of you may have joined that, and there's other places to kind of go through the definitions of this, but really we have seen such an evolution in even family foundations in the South, predominantly white foundations. So many different foundations have this growing awareness. And again, we're going to get to still the challenges of where it's not coming into place, but there is a much deeper baseline to work for so many. Also, just the complexities of our communities. There's also been a huge shift in terms of who's in philanthropy. And when I say huge shift, I mean, again, for every one of these things I'm going to say, I'm going to have some numbers that are proportionate to the broader field of philanthropy that are not great. So proportionally, because philanthropy has grown so much, we still have low percentages, but just in terms of flat out numbers, the numbers of CEOs of color that we have, the number of black CEOs, black women CEOs just in Chicago alone, the number of folks who were former organizers and who are now program officers is considerable. And that has made a huge difference in the way philanthropy is moving within different foundations. And then there's also been a proliferation of funder-driven networks, learning spaces, and again, for each one of these things, we go much more deeply in the guide to some pros and cons and maybe some course corrections needed about how some of these things are playing out. This last point about be careful what we wish for, there was so much call for funder leadership, funder engagement, and persistence change focus, which was really important and still is important, but we've also recognized there's some unintended consequences that we'll lay out a little bit further. So some of the statistics that I was saying are still relatively abysmal, and certainly when we think about the number that most folks have, and in fact I see we've actually got to update this graph. It says as of 2016, only 9.6% of domestic foundation funding focused on communities of color. We actually just we have a lag time from data from Candid, which was formerly Foundation Center and GuideStar merged. So this graphic was based on the 2016 numbers that were only partial, and now we have the full numbers, and it's gone up to a whopping 10%, which is, again, of course, given the needs, given the size of our communities, is really problematic and what we all need to be working to fight. But we would recognize that there have been, as I said, some trends upward in terms of those funders who are actually using explicit language. And some people will take that to mean, oh, they're talking the talk but not walking the walk. And we would say yes and no. Yes, there is a lead time of for some foundations of doing more talk than concrete action, but we would not say that it's all talk and no action. And we're going to lift up some examples, and I know that Maurine will be sharing some solid examples as well, that the level of practice in certain pockets has evolved greatly. And I think I try to say this a lot to foundations because as an advocate, we tend to focus on what's not happening. And I like to send the message that if you're not doing it, you are not keeping up with your peers, because your peers are moving this work in more significant ways around racial justice funding. And I think it's for a number of foundations that can be part of the push of recognizing where the center of the field is actually moving. There's also been, well, this one is disturbing, in that the general operating support for racial justice has gone down significantly. We're going to talk a lot more about, and we talk more about it in the guide, about what has been lagging in terms of the trust question of where foundations are going, and that's an area that we need to have significant shifts on. But then there is more funding moving towards grassroots organizing. It's still way too small, but it has been increasing in the more recent years. This quick piece is just to lift up that all of the numbers that I've just shared, we have some baseline that we aren't clear about in the field, that there isn't common agreement about what is or isn't defined as racial justice grant making. We at PRE, with our partners at Race Forward and Candid and Funders for LGBTQ Issues, put out some specific language in the infographic that those were drawn from, but which of course we drew from conversations with activists, but I wouldn't say there is clear agreed upon definitions field-wide. And then there are a number of other issues about the fact that some of you might know that the data, that even all of what we were just reporting is based on what's called the FC 1000, which is the top 1,000 largest funders, and so much of the progressive work is still done by smaller foundations. Going to the new guide, so what do we mean when we talk about the difference between racial equity versus racial justice? I realize that we are still saying versus in this title slide. We're going to shift that because we're not trying to imply that we still don't need to focus on racial equity. We still definitely need to focus on racial equity, but we are trying to have the work evolve more to think about racial justice. We talked about the fact that a racial equity lens really focused on separating symptoms from causes, but a racial justice lens brings into view the confrontation of power, the redistribution of resources, and the systemic transformation necessary for real change. These were some of the components that we lifted up in the original guide, that it analyzes data about race and ethnicity, that it understands the disparities and the reasons why they exist, looks at structural root causes, and names race explicitly when talking about problems and solutions. The and solutions part I put the emphasis on because so often foundations were lifting it up related to the problem side and then turning to universal approaches still. But a racial justice lens would still include all of those components, but deepen more of an understanding and acknowledgement of racial history, and importantly, focus on creating a shared affirmative vision of what a fair and inclusive society is, one that is informed by those most impacted, and focuses explicitly on building civic, cultural, and political power by those most impacted. And lastly, emphasizes transformative solutions that impact multiple systems. So going beyond simply a systemic approach, but how can we really create alternative solutions that can leverage much more? Watching my time, I'm going to move through a little bit more of what we lift up in our guide. And again, this is both from our deep interviews, but also PRE does advanced racial justice funder labs with a lot of foundations who already are doing work around racial equity and are looking to move to this deeper level. And what we've seen in this last decade plus is more resistance because there's more movement, right? So you have more foundations where you've got strong change agents advancing a lot of work, and they're running into these different forms of resistance and moving through them. And I want to really lift up, we just had at the Unity Summit, some of you all might have been there, with 1,000 other folks. We had a foundation CEO track that really focused on managing through internal and external resistance. And we wanted to recognize that there was a time where some of this resistance might have actually stopped movement. Now this resistance is really something that so many more are pushing through and advancing. And so I won't read all of these points, but we do share stories related to a number of these kinds of challenges. The basic one is really some folks wondering, yes, but is this taking us off mission? And for those who understand racial justice, that doesn't make sense. You would think about, you'd understand how it connects to all of the issues that you're most likely dealing with. But there are ways to lift that up with the data, showing examples from the field, working through different scenarios. This tactical one about won't that turn some people off, it's an interesting question that comes up. We've got some stories where there will be underlying and often just unspoken assumptions about who your audience is. And I've got a great story about one foundation where a white donor was concerned about being very explicit around the language of white supremacy in one of their foundation statements. And this president of a foundation donor was concerned that that might seem antagonistic, that might seem like language that would be breaking in the language of John Powell of looking at bridging, breaking, and bonding work. And the staff person was really on point to come back to him and share, it depends on who you think our audience is. As a predominantly white foundation, for us to use language to recognize white supremacy, we are actually bridging to the communities of color that we are seeking to build stronger relationships with. And, and the donor allowed it, and it went forward. And it was really an important reframe. The other piece that comes up continuously is, yes, this is important, but who has the time? And it can be from so many different parts of this work. And there's a tool that we would refer folks to using choice points, and it's really thinking about all of the parts of your work where you already have choices that either, frankly, are going to perpetuate the status quo and continue racial inequities and racial injustice, or can be altered in a way that, whether it's how you do your budget, how you do your site visits, how you communicate your grant proposals and requests for proposals, can all be shifted in a way that it's not additional work, that it is in fact just putting a clear racial justice lens on it. The other parts that are some, we said resistance claim or subtext, that really some of these things, again, they don't actually get said, it's just an underlying concern. But there are folks who, whether it's because of a particular portfolio that they have or their own racial and ethnic identity, get concerns of what this means for them. Where is their place in this work? And there are some conversations that have to happen that both recognize that racial justice and racial equity work is work that we all, folks of all different racial and ethnic lines, need to be engaged in, and there's value and there's roles for everyone. But then there's also conversations that might be where somebody is just not values aligned with the mission. And we've got, at our CEO track, actually, we had a number of foundations who shared the process that they undertook to recognize that alignment with mission values was part of a transitioning plan. It might be for staff or it might be for boards, and that alignment might be necessary. But there's also ways to ensure that you are reworking to engage folks. The last part about fear of racial conflict, I mean, the reality is conflict is a natural part of this process. There's a need to do more to strengthen conflict resolution muscles. Being prepared for it, anticipating it is really important, and anticipating it in a way that moves you through it, not immobilizes you. And building individual confidence in talking about this work is so critical. So these are a few different points, and okay, let me wrap up here. There's just a few points that when I talk about course corrections, we talked about systems change so much in our early years that we've had some create too much of a false dichotomy between systems and direct service, and some we are hearing back from a lot of community folks that get concerned that they are now getting rejected because they're doing direct service and not connected in the funder's mind to a racial justice oriented portfolio. But in fact, so many of the direct service providers don't make that false claim, and they are the ones who know most about what policies are relevant. This last one I'm torn about giving short shrift, but I will just say quickly that we dive deeply into this question about what funders should be doing before they continue to fund predominantly white organizations seeking to do equity work. And this is something that maybe in the Q&A we can talk about further. We are not saying white organizations shouldn't be doing this work. They certainly should. What we are saying is there are a series of questions that funders need to be looking at, because frankly there has been more of a focus on how do we bring support to those organizations to shift versus how do we support the groups that are emerging from the communities. And there is a lot of nuance that we need to pull back from. There's been a bit of pendulum swinging, and there's frankly a great cost to many groups of color to, in effect, subsidize the capacity building of these larger organizations. So with that, I'm going to actually skip these last two slides. We can go back if necessary during the Q&A, but it's just some additional tools about how to assess your portfolio or how to do better data collection. But I'll turn it over to Maureen. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori, and thanks, Sherilyn. Good afternoon, everybody, and happy holidays to you as well. Well, like many of the rest of you on the phone, DDCF was working diligently to ensure that our arts funding was equitable. And also, like many of you, we had read Helicon's Not Just Money report a while back, and we were pretty disappointed by the findings that it contained. Working in a formal collaboration with other funders to create the Mosaic Network and Fund provided us with an opportunity to leverage our resources and amplify our values. And it was one possible answer to the now what question. The Mosaic Network and Fund's primary goals are to establish a learning community of funders and practitioners dedicated to helping ALAANA arts organizations in New York City thrive over the longer term, secure new and increased funding for ALAANA arts organizations, and to make new connections by introducing new organizations to funders and vice versa. So taking it back a little bit for some history, in 2017, a group of New York City-based arts funders held a series of meetings to explore whether there might be something we could do together that we couldn't accomplish separately in order to address the challenges that local ALAANA arts organizations were experiencing. And as a result of those conversations, New York Community Trust and the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation co-commissioned a report from Yancey Consulting that same year to better understand the state of local ALAANA arts organizations. You can see the cover of it here on the left-hand side of your slide. This report provided 4 main recommendations. Most notably, the report called for a shift in our frame of thinking from sustainability or maintaining viability to thrivability, which is the ability to grow, flourish, and prosper. The report recommended increased investments in ALAANA arts organizations in terms of funding amounts and grant terms, and also regarding supporting general operating expenses to the extent that it was possible, rather than defaulting to solely project support. The report recommended building capacity within organizations, both through increased staffing for core operations and technical assistance. And finally, it recommended fostering peer connections to engage in mutual learning and building relationships. The report was released in January of 2018, and within a few months, we started a funder collaborative, which I'm proud to report now has 18 philanthropic organizations contributing to a pooled fund totaling $5,496,000. You can see that list of donor committee members here. We wanted to create a feasible, durable change, and we knew from the beginning that we wanted to bring down, or at the very least, lower the wall between funders and practitioners. So before we could even begin to think about the grants program, we wanted to work on building connections. We formed an advisory committee comprising 1/2 leaders of ALAANA arts nonprofits and 1/2 fund donors. Now you may see that there are 5 ALAANA organization leaders listed on this slide and 6 funders. That is because 2 different Duke foundations contributed to the fund, but in order to maintain the equity that we were looking to achieve, Zeba Rahman from the Doris Duke Foundation for Islamic Art and I shared 1 vote on all advisory committee decisions. So over the course of a year, the AdCom worked together to lay a foundation for our work. We recognized that what would endure was relationships and shared understanding. And we also knew that fundraising success notwithstanding, there would be more need for funding than resources available. So we landed on a commitment to create a network that could conceivably continue to build support for ALAANA organizations beyond the life of any individual initiative. To signal this point, we decided to rename what had been the Mosaic Fund to the Mosaic Network and Fund, signaling the importance and durability of the network. So the Mosaic Network and Fund is a bilateral learning network that facilitates exchanges between funders and ALAANA arts and culture organizations. It's also a grant-making program that awards multi-year support comprising up to 50% general operating support and tailored enhancement support. and a little bit more about tailored enhancement support in just a moment. The grants range in size depending on the grantee's budget and the grantee identified needs. So the learning exchanges were a main mechanism for fostering those connections and learning that I mentioned earlier. Wrong way, sorry. A design team of ALAANA Arts organization leaders and funders worked with a contracted facilitator to develop and conduct 4 learning exchanges, which took place over the course of 4 months. The design of individual sessions was dynamic, with adjustments to upcoming exchanges based on outcomes of those prior, and you'll see an example of that a little bit later. Content included sharing challenges, collaborative visioning, reflections on power, self-guided conversations between organizations and funders, and ideas on how to move the work forward after the conclusion of the LEXs. Approximately 150 folks representing arts and culture organizations and philanthropies participated, and they took place at ALAANA-controlled venues throughout the city. Overall, both the ALAANA organization representatives and funders agreed that the Learning Exchange series was worthwhile, and they wanted it to continue. But to be transparent, we did receive varied responses to each individual exchange. We did a fair amount of evaluation attendant to the learning exchanges, and one piece of that was asking the attendees to share how they felt at the end of each of the 4 sessions. So I have here for you some word clouds that track the responses to each exchange. So here's the first one. We felt pretty good about that. Then we had the second one. You can see there's a little bit of a different sentiment coming out of Learning Exchange number 2, and we'll circle back to this one in a moment. We had a much improved outcome for the penultimate Learning Exchange. And by the time we wrapped with Learning Exchange number 4, we had overall, as I mentioned earlier, a positive outcome. So going back, as you read, we again were not uniformly successful with each exchange, but we learned an awful lot about what design for the program and what activities would be more or less successful. So at Learning Exchange number 2 in particular, attendees reported that they felt unsure that the meeting design actually lent itself to careful listening and meaningful exchange. And then this was exacerbated by a sense of unclear instructions about what we were doing that day. But by the time we got to Learning Exchange number 3, as you saw, we used the information we gleaned from number 2 to make a number of adjustments, and we had a better outcome. So this initiative is very much a work in progress. And the results haven't been entirely even, but we do already have a few takeaways from what's happened that we'd like to share with you. First, when in doubt, always err on the side of humility. We as funders need to be extra vigilant about this, since many of us in our day-to-day work are looked to as authority figures and experts. And it's helpful, of course, to have colleagues who can keep you honest. Related to this, mind the gap, which is to say to acknowledge and constantly pay attention to the power dynamic, even when at first blush it may not be apparent to you. Finally, related again to the notion of humility, be sure that you are listening more than you are talking. It's important to honor the investment of time and intellectual capital that our partners at ALAANA organizations are making. In our case, we paid honoraria to the ADCOM members, and then we also provided stipends to each attendee at the learning exchanges. It was really important that we went to the folks we wanted to meet with, as opposed to assuming that they come to us. Again, linking back to this notion of the power dynamic. We wanted to ensure, to the degree that it was practical, accessibility. So we made sure to move these around, as I said earlier, throughout the boroughs. We didn't make it to each and every borough, but we made it to the majority of them. Be patient. So a process like this is guaranteed to always take more time than you think it will and require more effort than you think it will. For example, in hindsight, we were quite clear that we needed more time in advance to plan and execute the LEXs, and we also needed more time between each of them than what we had allowed. Related to this, we needed to appreciate that this was a long-term process that will require consistent commitment and work over an extended period. The advisory committee discussed the fact that technical assistance as a concept can often be experienced as top-down and can be then reductive as well. At the same time, we knew that there was a trove of rich learning already resident among the organizations and that they could share that with one another. This led us to reframe the notion of traditional technical assistance and to begin to think of it as tailored enhancement support, signaling that there were assets already present within this cohort of organizations, but that there was the possibility of enhancement that could partner with them to increase their impact rather than assistance, which perhaps might inadvertently signal that there was a deficit present. For example, our support could be used perhaps to underwrite consulting time for one executive or artistic director to work with another one. They might not be thought of as traditional technical assistance consultants, but yet they have a great deal of information and support to offer to their colleagues. And we wanted to be sure that we had a mechanism that was appropriately flexible to support that. Now, speaking on that last point, although it was not, to be fair, a primary intention of ours, we realized that the practitioners really greatly valued the opportunity to be in the room with one another. And they talked a lot about not having really had many spaces to do that. They met a lot of new people. They talked about partnering on projects and artistic efforts. And they thought that was one of the biggest takeaways and contributions of the learning exchanges overall. Lastly, we understood, as I said a moment ago, that we were working inside of a larger context, which is something that Lori also mentioned in her presentation. This piece of work is just beginning, and this piece of work, like a nesting doll, sits inside of a larger piece, and it will morph and expand. It represents one piece in the beginning of a movement that knits together a number of folks working across a number of sectors. So just to summarize, at the end of the day, we raised almost $5.5 million, having started with a goal of about $3 million. So we were very encouraged by that. We secured the ongoing commitment of 18 local funders to work together. We reviewed 173 grant applications for support. Now, let me say a little bit more about that. Based on the research that we had done very, very early in the initiative, we had projected that the majority of applications will come from organizations with budgets of less than $1 million. But in fact, at the end of the day, we received the largest portion of applications from relatively larger organizations, those with budgets between $1 million and $3 million. That meant that at the end of the day, although we had hoped to fund 30 organizations over the 3-year grant periods, we only had enough resources to fund 27. But as I mentioned earlier, initially we'd set a fundraising goal of $3 million. At that point, we were projecting being able to support a total of 10 organizations with 3-year grants and technical assistance or enhancement support. At the end of the day, we won because we were able to make 27 rather than 10. Now, just finally to say that's still far less than the need and than the meritorious work that's happening in the sector. So we are hoping, again, that this is the beginning of something larger. A couple of final thoughts. We established that the practitioners in the room were leaders and that it was worthy to listen to them and learn from them. And that, in fact, it wasn't about the foundations. Again, back to this idea that in many cases we're looked to as experts, but in this situation, it was better to listen to and learn from our colleagues in the field if we wanted to create something that would truly serve the entire arts community. And we helped to forge new connections and strengthen existing ones. I want to say that none of this would have really been possible without my co-chair for the Networking Fund, Carrie McCarthy, and the fantastic Salam Segai, who's been the project manager. We're looking forward to continuing this work in the years to come, beginning with another learning exchange sometime next spring. So now I'm happy to turn it back to Sherilyn.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you. Those were great presentations. And it was nice to hear all of the successes that you experienced, Maureen, with the Mosaic Networking Fund, and hearing about sort of thinking about the goals that you'd set initially and surpassing those, but still recognizing that there's more work to be done. And also, Lori, all of the statistics that you shared about sort of the state of grant making and giving for people of color versus domestic giving, and then the different types of funders, I think that was really helpful in providing a lot of framing and perspective. So at this point, we are transitioning into the Q&A section of the webinar. So if you have any questions, you can insert your questions in the Q&A box to the bottom of your screen, and please be specific about who the question is for. And so with that, I will begin with a question for you, Maureen, actually. So thinking about the advisory committee, what was the criteria for selecting the advisory committee members?
Thanks, Sherilyn. Well, we were thinking about a number of things, and of course it's important to say you can't necessarily have all of these things resident in 5 people, but we did our very best. So we were interested in geographic diversity, so across the 5 boroughs of New York City. We were also interested, obviously, in racial and ethnic diversity, discipline diversity as well, experienced leaders who had enough networks, experience, and contacts to be able to take a broader view beyond that of their own organizations to really consider what might be possible to impact the entire field locally. So those were some of the things that we were thinking about when we identified the advisory committee, the ALAANA folks on the advisory committee. In terms of the funders, we really selected from beyond, among funders who had contributed to the pooled fund at a certain level.
Sherilyn, are you still with us? We'll get Sherilyn back here in just a second, so stay tuned.
Well, this is Lori. I don't know if it's useful. I don't see questions yet, but perhaps I can share one of the questions that I know Sherilyn and I spoke about was some of the disconnect between some foundations using the right language and yet realizing that we still have this lag happening in terms of what's getting funded. And one of the things that I would share is that we do have some foundations where you've got some of the staff and even the board approving some powerful racial equity statements, and folks are moving in the right direction, and yet they haven't really gone through the harder work of aligning to recognize, are they all in fact talking about the same thing? And so we have some guidance for that, for really testing for shared meaning and asking for repeat backs, really deepening how everybody is understanding it. And I will say part of this is kind of a holdover from, I think, some of us who were moving this work earlier in the 90s and in the early 2000s. There were a lot of folks who were focused on kind of moving under the radar. And it's like, okay, well, if you could get somebody to approve this loosely without fully understanding, maybe we can get some of these grants through and just get some of the money out the door. But what we're finding there is not only do things get stopped, but once whatever particular change agent leaves that institution, the change hasn't happened and work isn't really solidified. And one example I've got of that is a foundation, a community foundation who had this incredible RFP that talked about tackling structural racism. It was really one of the more progressive statements I'd seen in a long time. And then when I started exploring more about their foundation, they had a 20-person board that was all white, who had never gone through deeper conversations around racial justice. And it was just so clear, your board does not mean the same thing that you mean by this. And so we actually had to take them all the way back through and start at a much earlier stage, you know, which on one hand might have seemed like a backward movement, but was in fact a critical movement forward.
Thank you. Here's a question for either one of you, I think. Many of our members have staff that may be further ahead on racial justice than their boards. What are some of the ways you have seen boards get moved? Many of our members, okay, either one of you want to take that?
Lori, I'll defer to you as having connected with more boards on this issue than I, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure. Well, there's so many different ways, and I think that it's interesting. It's part to try to think about how you move your board. Partly it is this establishing some shared language. It's also thinking about, I've seen foundations that have a cadre of board champions that the staff and some of the board champions can really engage in deeper connecting and have them help lead and bring their peers along. One of the things that is also important is to not underestimate. On one hand, not underestimate the potential of where your board can go. I've seen a lot of foundations, leaders think that their board wouldn't be comfortable with a conversation, or so, you know, they have particular ideas of where certain people are in the board, and find out that they're actually very surprised in who has what different personal story that might spark some different kind of connection. But on the flip side, there's also a danger in overestimating. I had one foundation CEO who was like, oh no, our board is terrific. They all get it. They're all, you know, it's just, they're all the way there. And they ended up being one of our more challenging engagements because, again, that notion of where folks are at. So we have some specific tools in it, but I would say it starts with doing a deeper, clear assessment of where they are, and some of that, there's a number of tools out there in the field. We've got some, NCRP Power Moves has some, our catalytic change is another one, that even seeing where different board members and staff start out on where they think the foundation is can be a useful starting place.
I would just tag on a little bit of that to really affirm what Lori is sharing. You know, one of the things that I've seen is that many of our trustees or board members are actually dealing with these issues in their day-to-day work lives in the corporate arena or wherever they're, or university setting or wherever it is that they're working. So in fact, it won't be a brand new conversation for many of them. It might be a brand new conversation at the board table at your organization. But I do think that this notion of identifying a couple of champions to work with the CEO really can make all the critical difference.
Great. Okay, we have one more question at our disposal here. Can you give some guidance as to how you identify whether an organization is an ALAANA organization? Is it based on leadership or board or staff or audiences served?
I'm happy to speak about that a little bit. And GIA actually has some guidance on its website, in the racial equity section of the website, that speaks to the characteristics of an ALAANA organization. In shorthand, it talks to the notion of by, for, and about. So, and you're not looking for necessarily all of them to be present, but for a couple of those characteristics to be present. One obvious characteristic would be the mission of the organization. You're also looking to who their primary audience is, who the leadership is on both the board and staff side, and who their programming is directed to. So, and to distinguish that from an organization that might be a large budget organization that does occasional programming for ALAANA audiences, or that sees itself as more of a general audience organization that is trying to provide a little something for everyone. We're really looking for at least two of those characteristics to be present in order to meet the criteria, I guess, that GIA espouses with regard to that definition of ALAANA organization.
Great. And Charlotte,
If I could, if I could, this is Lori. If I could just jump in on the flip side of that, because we speak so specifically about this challenge of predominantly white-led organizations, we really we went back and forth about how we were going to define that, and we really emphasized that it's about who the decision makers are in what we're talking about in terms of whether something predominantly white-led. And that's not a numeric thing. It's not a, oh, is it the majority statistically of the board is people of color, or the CEO, or the staff, or the constituency. It is, as Maureen was saying, it's a bit of all of those things. But we know organizations that have both been historically white and might only have 2 white staff members, and all of the rest of the folks are folks of color. They could even have a majority board of color at a given moment, but those 2 white staff members might be the CEO and the deputy, or the ones who are clearly the last word and the first word in terms of decision making. And so from a funder's standpoint, it does take that deeper look. It isn't something that you can just straight up go through, like, let me just check off this box, this one fits this or doesn't.
Charlotte?
Great, thanks. Yeah, Maureen, did you already speak to that? I believe when I got back in, you did. But I want to give space if you haven't.
To the question that you've shared? No.
To the left?
I didn't. No. Oh, no, I did not. I was sorry, looking at the wrong box.
Okay.
So and the question is, did we encounter any pushback from white-led organizations?
Yeah, you can speak to that. You can speak to that, please.
Okay. So we really have not experienced any overt pushback. I'm sure there's been some behind the scenes, but it's really been more about the thing that Lori mentioned, which is organizations that want to figure out how to get support for their own efforts with regard to equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it's less about resistance and more about, can I get support for this because we are doing this too. So that is where your discernment in terms of who really has expertise, long-term commitment demonstrated to this work, and how that's showing up for them in not only their words, but their actions and their budget, which tells you a story as well. So we didn't actually have a situation where we had to deal with any overt pushback.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then, Lori, just in your work and offering the racial justice trainings that you do, have you experienced any pushback from white-led organizations? Of course, the people who come to the trainings, they're coming in wanting to learn more, but I'm sure there might have been some resistance at times. Can you speak to that?
Well, for PRE, we do these advanced practice racial justice funders labs that are less of a straight-up racial justice training. They are, in fact, a deeper dive that we curate very particularly of foundations who are further along. So it is less of a situation of getting pushback than seeing just the nuanced, deep levels of where people are surprisingly still grappling with real difficulties. And I don't mean surprising like it's not that this work is so complex, but where without naming them, but some of the foundations who you all might look to, or we would look to as some of the biggest leaders, when you start drilling down is when you start seeing how challenging, even for the most advanced practitioners, this work is. When you really start getting into how do we move beyond simply funding more community of color-led work, but really talking about what kind of power we're building, what kind of relationship we're in, who's driving the agenda. But from a straight pushback perspective, I have seen in some of the partnerships that we've done in more one-offs with some of the different PSOs, whether it be issue-based or regionally, are some, going back to the questions that we lifted up about resistance. Some people might think, well, that's all well and good for this particular area, but we have a very technical kind of area. We get this a lot in different parts of the environment where it's like, yes, but we are just looking for the best, or some of these things that can be, on one hand, of course, straight up offensive, but it also belies just a disconnect in what they are seeing as ultimately impactful and the measure. So,
yeah.
But very rarely these days, there's very rarely folks who are, at least in our space, who are going to be so overtly saying, yeah, we don't even think this is important.
Right. No, yeah, which is, I think, a great step in the right direction for many folks. And I think you speaking to, you said, we're looking for the, I'm going to paraphrase here, looking for the art that's quote unquote the best, and thinking about coded language and what it means to use, why we think XYZ is the best or not. So I think that you made a great point there. Kicking back to you, Maurine, so the Mosaic Network and Fund, you started the collaborative project with the New York Community Trust in 2017, and we're almost at 2020, and you've had a lot of successes, as you shared. But if you had to start over from the very beginning, what would you have done differently?
I really do think the main thing would be to allow more time.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems weird since you just described that it's been, although it was late 2017,
right.
We're approaching 3 years. But I think that in some cases, this work doesn't align perfectly with foundation timelines in terms of soliciting, because in our case, we were fundraising. So when you're fundraising, as you all know, folks are trying to figure out what docket can I put this on, what's the grant term, when do I need to see outcomes, and that sort of thing. And in some ways that is really creates a set of tensions with a kind of deliberate, methodical and deep investment of time that the work requires in order for it to be built to last. So I mentioned the learning exchanges, and we tried to get them done in a certain period of time because it was super important to us to try and make the grants in 2019. And we've made it by the skin of our teeth. But what we lost along the way was enough breathing space between each of those learning exchanges, and even leading up to the first one, to be quite as nuanced and thoughtful in putting them on as we should have been, I think. So that's really the main thing. And let me also acknowledge that sometimes when things take a long time, people lose interest. They start out really fired up and engaged, and over time it can feel, the energy can start to leach away. Mm-hmm. So a challenge that rides alongside being committed over an extended period of time is how do you maintain the energy and enthusiasm and commitment. So I don't say more time lightly, but I think it is essential.
Yes. No, and I think a lot of people would agree that when doing a project like, or an initiative like the Mosaic Network and Fund, it's always helpful to have a little bit more planning time to see what you've done and sort of go back and be, not, as you said, not to lengthen the timeline necessarily, but be a little bit more strategic in a different way, I should say. So yeah, so that was the last question that we had time for today, and so I want to thank our presenters. Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Lori. You offered such thoughtful and great information, and I'm so glad that I was here to be with. So today's presentation has been recorded, so everyone will receive that recording after the webinar, and we will also provide you with a link so that you can access a PDF of the slides, and you'll receive that in the next few days. Immediately upon closing the webinar box, you will receive a survey, and we ask that you do take time to complete it because it does help us plan for future programs. And this is actually the last webinar for the year, so kudos to you if you made it and closed out the year with us. And if you have further questions, you can feel free to reach out to me, Sherilyn Seeley. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks so much.